We're back again looking at the single process operations model, and we're looking at some simple inventory scenarios. You'll see here on the output sheet we've added the inventory outputs, both the outputs that the model calculates and the differences on the right hand side. So we have some inputs related to inventory, time and inventory actually. On the left here we have the number of varieties or number of product variants, which in this case we're saying is 1. Then we've got two parameters that define raw material stock, the minimum stock or safety stock level, and the time between deliveries. We have some parameters that define intermediate stock, the hold time, and the minimum sawtooth or the safety stock of that. And we have finished goods similar parameters. On the right hand side in green, the model calculates a few inventory and time parameters. So let's play with a few of these numbers and see what happens. Let's start with the raw material minimum stock. Suppose that wasn't 14 days, suppose that was 5. Change that. We'll go now to the output sheet. You can see here that it changes the raw material inventory. And you'll also notice that it changes the material value by the same amount as the material, labor and overhead. Clearly we haven't changed labor and we haven't changed overhead, so there's no reason why that factor should change. Let's go back and try another one. We'll change that back to 14, and we'll change the minimum stock from 7 days to 1 day. So this is the finished goods stock that we're holding as though we were a distributor. This time you can see that it changes the finished goods stock. The material value of that changes by about $7,000, but the material, labor and overhead part of that changes by a larger number to account for the fact that we have added labor and overhead. M, L and O stands for material, labor and overhead, often called the burdened inventory. Let's try something else. We'll put that back to 7. Let's go back and change one of the numbers that we changed for the cost scenarios. Let's change the material value added from $1.25 to 1. As before, you can see the cost differences, but you can also see that that change affects inventory. In fact, it affects all the inventory numbers. It affects raw material. Because the material is cheaper, 5 days worth is actually worth less money than it was before. Even though it has the same number of days of stock, it's worth less. Likewise, work in progress is actually held for the same amount of time, but because the material value is less, then the value of the WIP is less. Similarly for finished goods. Now you'll notice here that changing the material cost hasn't done anything to the burden cost. In fact, you can see that changing material cost doesn't change the fully burdened inventory any differently from the material only value of it. Okay, I'm going to put that one back to where we were, $1.25. And this time let's play with labor rate. You wouldn't think labor rate would have anything to do with inventory, but let's just see. We changed that from 14 to 10.25. And here you can see that we had the cost difference that we saw before. The material value, of course, hasn't changed of inventory. It's still the same pile of stuff. If you looked around the shop floor, there would be no difference at all to it. But rather strangely, you can see that the fully burdened value, the M, L and O value of the inventory actually reduces. This is the case of where the shop floor man would say, I don't understand, but the finance man would say, well, that's the way the rules say it should be. Now we're going to take a look at a process change which affects cost and inventory. So let's go to the process tab. Let's change batch size from 2500 to 5000. So we're going to double the batch size. See what effect that has. Well, we've got all blue on the cost front. We've saved material cost, we've saved volume related labor, we've saved batch related labor. On the inventory side, we've gone red in some places. The color red here means that we've increased inventory. So what's going on? First question is, why has raw material inventory reduced? Well, you have to think of what's happening with the fixed batch waste. We said that fixed batch waste is 300. So when we double the batch size to 5000, we're actually wasting less material. But by wasting less, we need less material to correspond to, say, 5 days worth. So the same number of days worth of stock is actually less material. On the other hand, work in progress increases because making that batch of 5000 is going to take longer. The actual in-process or processing time of that 5000 size batch is going to take longer. And when it takes longer, that means there's more of it, so the inventory value of it goes up. The reason why finished goods inventory goes up is because the sawtooth gets larger. We still go down to 7 days minimum, but the length of the sawtooth is now the length of the time a 5,000 batch as opposed to for a batch of 2,500. If you then look at the fully burdened value of these, you can see that the raw material inventory is the same. We don't burden raw material, but the other two numbers go up in proportion. Now overall, if we reduce cost but increase inventory, this is not an improvement in our book. So it's at best a compromise. So if you were going to propose that as an improvement, you would have to do something to mitigate that inventory increase. For your information, these examples are the same as scenarios 7 to 11 in our book, Bridge of Faith for Operations.